In this video, I'll explore using displacement in 3ds Max. For this particular video, I'll be using 3ds Max Design 2010, and while I'm using the latest version of 3ds Max, the information that I go over here and some of the modifiers and displacement options that I use are still valid for previous versions of 3ds Max as well. So what is displacement? Displacement is basically as it sounds. You're displacing the normals of a mesh in a given direction. It's similar to a bump map effect, except a bump map is basically just an effect that happens, for example, on materials. Displacement actually displaces the faces of a mesh. And as with so many things in 3ds Max, there are numerous ways that you can use displacement. There's displacement in materials, there's displacement modifiers, there's displacement space warps. There's just all kinds of ways to use this, but basically they all do similar things. The end goal is to displace whatever either the modifier is on or the material is applied to, etc. So let's just begin by looking at the displacement modifier. So what I'll do is just quickly create a ground plane here, just a plain object. And one thing to keep in mind is the number of segments on an object that you're going to displace, because a lot of the displacement functions may come in and actually subdivide the mesh for displacement. So the starting segments is pretty critical for a lot of displacement options. So to kind of get an eye for the segments here, it's probably a good idea to turn on edge faces. And I'm going to get rid of the grid because it's kind of hard to see these edges with that grid enabled. So I just hit the shortcut G to enable or disable the grid. And right now I believe I'm set up with Mental Ray as the production renderer. So what I'll do is come in and disable Final Gather because I don't want any indirect illumination calculated on these if I want to render some of these scenes just as tests. I don't want to wait for that. And in the newer versions, 2009 and 2010, Final Gather is enabled by default whenever you choose Mental Ray as your renderer. So just remember, if you're just testing, you may want to turn that off so you don't have to wait for indirect illumination calculations. And you don't have to use Mental Ray for this. It's just that's what I have set up, so that's what I'm going to go with. You could just as well use the Scanline renderer or V-Ray or whatever renderer of your choice. Okay, so we're first going to look at the displacement modifier. And you can go over to the Modify tab here, and we have our plain object, primitive object selected, and you can just drag down or select this drop-down box, and you can scroll down to the displacement modifier and you can click that. Another way that you could do basically the same thing is go to the modifiers option here, and if you scroll down to parametric deformers, you can see that there's a displace option, and if I click that, it just adds that same modifier that we just added using the drop down box here. It's the same thing. So we have the displacement modifier added to this object now. So here in the options for the displace modifier, to begin we have a strength, and obviously that is the strength or the intensity of the actual displacement that this modifier will create. There's a decay option here, and with decay set to 0, the displacement has the same strength or intensity throughout the object here. If I start using this decay, then it will actually diminish the strength of the displacement away from the displacement's gizmo. And you can see the gizmo by clicking on this plus sign next to the displace modifier, and you get the gizmo. And basically that's just a center point. You can move this gizmo around, place it wherever it needs to be. I'm just going to leave it where it is for now. Okay, next we have a luminance center, and what this does is basically sets the level of gray. What you want to do when you're using the displacement option, this displacement modifier, excuse me, is use a black and white grayscale map here. And what this does is, by default, the center point is 0.5, which is medium gray, or 128. If you think of it as 0 to 256 colors, the center point of 0.5 is 128. And what that means is that anything above 128 will extrude when using we're using this on a planar object. Anything above 128 will extrude upwards along the z-axis in this viewport. Anything below 128 will extrude negatively on the z-axis as well. So you can modify that luminance center to kind of give you an offset for what areas are negatively displaced versus positively displaced. Now, if you note, I was careful to say that it displaces upwards and downwards because I'm using a planar displacement here. You have different options. You could use cylindrical, spherical, or shrink wrap types of displacement here. If you use anything other than planar, then this luminance center, instead of extruding the normals up and down, it's basically a calculation towards that center gizmo, the center of the gizmo here. Okay, so in the next section here we have bitmap option and a map option. The bitmap option is obviously where you can assign a bitmap to this displacement, and again, you're looking for a grayscale image to use here. So what I'll do is just scroll and go pick a map for use here, and I have this terrain map, and now you can see it's actually displacing that mesh quite nicely. You can also notice that it's a fairly dense mesh. So that's one of the drawbacks to using this particular displace modifier, is since we have this fairly dense mesh here, I could go ahead and just disable edge faces to give you a better idea of what the actual mesh looks like here. And as you can tell, displacement works really well for displacing or creating objects like terrains. It's really nice for creating terrains and things like that for your scenes. So again, let's just take a look at the gizmo option here. Again, this is just things like the center point of the displacement. You can move this gizmo around if you wanted to actually move where the displacement is happening on the mesh. Let me just put that back at center. You could also scale this if you wanted to, just scale that gizmo inward or outward, whatever you needed to do there. Now, you don't have to use just a bitmap for this. If I click on remove bitmap, I could also just use a map here. So if you click on map, you could use any of the 3ds Max maps, such as a checker pattern or whatever you wanted to use. Probably some good options to use here would be like the noise or the smoke map. So what I'll do is come down and just grab the smoke map here. And you can see how that just immediately goes into displacing the mesh here. It's using that smoke procedural map. You can drag this over to the material editor as an instance copy, and that way if you wanted to change some of the settings you could do so, and you can see what it's doing here pretty much in real time in your viewport. If you wanted to swap that around, give it some more iterations, change the phase here, whatever really you wanted to modify, you can get some pretty quick feedback in the viewport here on that. So again, you can see that this would be somewhat useful for creating terrains and things like that in your scenes. And again, you could use whatever maps that you wanted to use here, cellular or checker, and just again drag it to your material editor as an instance copy, so that when you make changes it updates here in your viewport and on the object as well. Below the map option here, you of course can remove the map, but you also have a blurring capability. So if as I start moving that, you can see what it's doing. Kind of a neat way here to make some acoustical tiling is to use the checker map along with this blur option. And basically that's the displace modifier. Displacement here, like this displacement modifier. So that can get quite heavy in your scenes if you're not careful. Okay, so let me remove this displace modifier. And similar to the displace modifier, you have a displace space warp. So if you go over to space warps here, you can see that there's a displace option here. And I'll just drag that out like so in the viewport. And if you go to the modify options on it, you can see that it's basically the same thing as the displacement option, as the displacement modifier. The options here are basically the same. What I could do is just come in and assign our bitmap back to this particular image. Let me just scroll down and grab this terrain again. And of course, with a space warp, you need to bind this space warp to an object. So I'll just select this object and come up here to bind to space warp and select that, and then I just left mouse click on the object and drag while holding that mouse button down, just drag it over to that space warp, and you can see the icon change here. And once I connect that, it's now linked to this space warp. So what I need to do is I've assigned the bitmap that I want to use, and of course I need to give it some strength. Let's just make this 1.5. But as you can see, there's nothing happening here in the viewport. Let me turn off these edge faces right quick. The reason for that is that the space warp is not over or near the object here. If I just select the space warp here and drag it, you can see it starting to displace this mesh now. So you could pretty much place this where you wanted it. You could scale that space warp object if you wanted to. But you can see that the end result is basically the same as what we had with the displace modifier, except with the space warp you can move this around, link it to multiple objects. If you wanted to animate that space warp, you could do so. And again, I went to the space warps tab here, but you could also go to create space warps and forces, and then there's the displace space warp. And the same thing that we added here is just another way to get to it. Okay, so now I can just delete that, and what I'll do is go back and enable my edge faces, and for the next section I'm going to decrease this down to, let's say, 12, because now I want to look at a different modifier for doing displacement, and that's going to be the displace approximate option here. Now this actually doesn't do the displacement. What this modifier does is control the number of subdivisions for the displacement. And so to use this, what I need to do now is, on top of that displacement approximate modifier, I need to apply a displace, something like this displace mesh world space modifier. And what I'll do for now is just disable this, just turn that option off for now. Now, in order to see what all this does, what this displacement approximate modifier does, I need to use materials for this. So what I'm going to do is apply a, let's just use a standard material. I'm going to apply that to this mesh, and then in the maps rollout there's a displacement option on this particular material. And so what I'll do is I'm just going to drag this existing map over to this displacement option as it went on, because it should be, if I turn this off and give this a render, well, probably the best way to show this is just to show this displacement approximation modifier enabled, and then enable this displace mesh binding world space modifier, because what that's going to do is show you in the viewport here what this is doing. So if I select this displace approximate modifier, and once I change these subdivision presets, you'll be able to see how that's changing here in the viewport. So what this does is it allows me to work with a lower resolution mesh. Let's say, for example, I wanted 24 by 24, which isn't that dense of a mesh to work with. That's still pretty light for the viewport and for the scene. And then what I could do is come into the apply this displacement approximate modifier, and I could either set it to low, medium, or high, what I wanted. And I can't see what it's doing here, so in order to see that, I use this Displace Mesh Binding World Space modifier and enable that. And now I can see what's going on here on this object. So as I increase, and really I don't think I want to go to high with this setting here because providing a lot of detail here, a lot of segments. But the neat thing about this is that you notice that there's fewer segments here in the bottom where it's not needed. It's kind of flat down here. So what I could do is modify the settings here as to where that segmentation occurs. So if I increase this angle value here, you can see that it's mostly segmenting up higher where I actually need that amount of detail. I don't need a lot of detail down here on the bottom because that was primarily smooth to begin with. So what I could do now is probably go up to the high setting, give this a minute to calculate, and when you, just a side note, when you do change these, you notice that it reset my angle. So let me just put that back to 25. And so now I have a somewhat of a controlled segmentation on this mesh, or I shouldn't say segmentation, subdivision of this particular mesh. So that's quite handy over the where that subdivision is going to happen. And so that will help you with your memory from running out of memory and things like that when you're using that. I used a standard material for this example. If you're using Mental Ray, and let's just say you use an Arc and Design material here, and you notice it has the displacement option as well. If I just drag this, actually I'll just drag the map. You see I'm using the same map here on this material. If I just drag this down to the displacement option as an instance copy, and if I apply this material to our terrain, you can see that it looks the same, but on this Displace Mesh Binding World Space modifier, if you click Update Mesh, you can see that it is actually not displacing the mesh. If I increase that and update mesh again, it's still not displacing the mesh. So it appears that this only works when you use a standard material. I can update it now. You can see that it actually is displacing the mesh. So I just wanted to point out that if you're using this Arc and Design material in Mental Ray and trying to get this to work and it's not, you may have to switch over to a standard material. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and delete these modifiers and just go ahead and reset the material editor here. Okay, so now as I mentioned before in the beginning of this video, I am using Mental Ray for this scene here. So what I want to look at now is using some of the Mental Ray displacement options and the material options for displacement here. So when you're using Mental Ray, displacement generally occurs when you use materials with displacement applied to the object that you want displaced. The settings for the displacement, if you go into the render settings and under the renderer tab and scroll all the way down to the bottom, you have a shadows and displacement rollout. At the very bottom of that, you have the displacement global settings. These are, as it says, global settings. You also have local settings, and you access those by selecting an object in the scene and right click on that object and go to Object Properties. In the Object Properties, you have a Mental Ray tab. And if you select that, you'll notice that there's a displacement option here. Right now it's set up to use the global settings, which are the global settings here in the renderer settings. But if I wanted to use local settings for a particular mesh, I could just disable that and use the settings here. These settings are basically the same. They're identical to the settings that you see here. The main difference between them is that you'll notice here in the renderer tab, for this option here, we have max subdivisions. Oops, sorry about that. We have max subdivisions versus in the object properties we have a max level. These are the same features, except they're just named differently. This wasn't modified to fit this. So when you're changing the max subdivision, you're changing the max level. And I'll explain what that does shortly, but I just want to point out that the difference in terminology here, even though that it does the same thing. So I'm just going to set that back to use global settings and hit OK. Alright, so let's look at some of these settings for the displacement global settings here. We have the first two options here. Let's look at this view option. What this does is it defines the space for displacement. For example, when this option is on, you'll notice that the edge length is defined in pixels. When I disable this option, the edge length changes to measurement value here, which is basically just world space units. So you can go from pixels to world space units. So if you needed to define a specific edge length, you could do so by switching that off instead of using the pixel length. This edge length value here defines the smallest potential edge length due to subdivision. So what happens is that Mental Ray actually subdivides the mesh, and that's what this max subdivide does. You can set the level of subdivision. A lower value here, as you can tell, is going to give you more detail. So basically what happens is that this value stops the subdivision process. Once it reaches 2 pixels in this case, it knows that it doesn't need to subdivide that anymore. So a lower value here will allow it to subdivide down to 1 pixel, or subdivide an edge down to 1 pixel, or even half a pixel, or whatever you put in there. So you can see, generally speaking, lower values will give you more detail, but of course it subdivides more, so that may cause problems with memory. So you kind of want to be careful with this. So this max subdivide, basically it controls how many times Mental Ray subdivides a triangle on your mesh. So at this default value of 16K, which is 16,384, and I'm using this from the help file, the example that it uses. This default value means that Mental Ray can subdivide each triangle into as many as 16,384 smaller triangles. So as you can imagine, that's a lot of calculations going on. That would be a lot of displacement, especially on something that on an object that is already subdivided quite extensively. This max displace controls the maximum offset in world units. As you can see, this is in world units instead of pixels, sort of like we switched up here. But this controls the maximum offset in world units that can be given to a vertex when displacing it. That may not make a bunch of sense right now, but what I'll do is kind of show you what that does when I get into actually showing the displacement here. Finally, you have this smoothing option, and let me just show you what this does. It basically tells Mental Ray whether to pre-smooth a mesh or not when displacing the mesh. And the best way to view this is a trick that Zap Anderson showed me, and I'll just go ahead and close this out, and I'll just delete this for now. And what you can do to see this happen is create a sphere in your scene like so, and you want it to be low poly. So I'm just going to use this kind of like 8-segment sphere here. You can see it's not very round. And what I want to do is apply a material to this. I'm going to put an Arc and Design material on this and come down to the displacement settings. And I'm just going to plug a checker map in here and then use the same color for both of these, because I don't want it to actually displace anything. I just want to use this kind of as a flag for displacement. And then I'm going to come back to my render settings here, and noted in the object properties here, if you notice here it says smoothing, you turn this off with height maps. So that's kind of one of those tool tips that would be nice to have here, so that when you hovered over that you could get that message to turn that off with height maps. Okay, so now let's just go ahead and get into setting up some displacements here. As you can see, I'm going to use this Arc and Design material, And let me just turn off reflections here because I don't need to calculate that one just to show this displacement. And basically you have a built-in displacement on the Arc and Design material. So if I wanted to put a let's say a cellular map here, and I'm just going to make this a black and white map, and probably change the size down to maybe 0.5 and render this. Similar to the displacement modifiers that we were using earlier, you can see that this is actually displacing this mesh. Let me just make this larger and render again so it's a little more obvious. You can see that it's actually displacing that and extruding the shape out of the normals here of that object. It's not a bump effect, it's actually changing the geometry a bit here. And so right now the subdivisions are fairly high on this mesh. As I was saying before, if I decrease this, it's not going to subdivide as much, and so we won't have as much detail, especially on a low poly object such as this. So I'm just going to set this down to 4 and render again. And you can see that basically nothing happened. There's not enough subdivisions there, not enough segments for it to actually do anything. So increase that to 64. And it's starting to round it off now. Come up to 1K. And we're slowly getting more details in here. Now likewise, if this mesh was a little more detailed, for example, instead of 8 segments, if I had 64, and I go back down to subdivisions of 4 and render again, you can see that we're getting some displacement here. And if I come up to 16, a little bit more division, a little bit more detail. And so 64 gives us a little more detail. If I go to 256, that's probably about as high as I will need to go with this particular mesh. This looks the same as when I had that set to 8 segments using 16K for the subdivisions here. So the point that I'm making here is that if your mesh is highly subdivided or rather detailed, you definitely want to decrease this value down so that you're not subdividing when it's not needed. Like I could increase this up to 4K, but you're not going to see a huge difference between the 4K version and this 256 version. The difference that you will see is in your render time and your memory consumption because of, and we'll decrease the blur on that just to make it fairly sharp. And so now we're getting a lot more detail in there. If I zoom in a little bit closer, and let's increase the max subdivisions up to 4K. So that's some very detailed subdivisions that we're getting here. Likewise, if I was to go in and increase this edge length, let's say back to the default of 2 and render that again, I've lost a little bit of the fine detail here. It may be hard to see, so let me load this into the RAM player, and that way we can do a quick comparison. And I'll slide this out of the way and decrease that edge length down to, let's say, 0.25 and render that again. Alright, so I'll bring this back into channel A, and so you can see the difference in quality that you get by adjusting that edge length. And again, the lower value that you go with the edge length setting, the more detail that it's going to produce for you. Alright, so let me clear this out and let me bump this back up to, I'll just leave it at 1 and delete this object, and let's look at creating a terrain here using the displacement, similar to what we did with the displacement modifiers. So I'll go into the material editor, and on this material, instead of using a cellular procedural map, I'll just assign a bitmap. And I'll go in and grab the terrain texture that I used previously. Alright, and what I want to do is just decrease the blur value on this just so that it's as sharp as it can be, and maybe go ahead and turn on the visible in viewport and apply this to our mesh here. The downside to using the displacement on the materials here is that we can't see what that's going to do in the viewport, short of knowing that black values here are low spots versus white are the high spots here. So you can kind of get an idea of what's going on by the black and white image once you show that in your viewport. But unlike using the displacement modifiers where we actually saw that in the viewport, you can't really get that here. So what I'll do is just give this a quick render. And as you can see, there's really not much displacement here. There's a little bit that you can see. Let me just move in a little bit closer here. And so obviously what I need to do is increase this displacement value. See that there's a mental ray connection rollout here at the bottom. And in that rollout there's a displacement option that is locked by default. You can unlock that by just clicking this button here with the left mouse button. I just click it and enable or disable that lock. When this is unlocked, then this particular material will use this displacement map instead of this displacement map. And what you have here is, if you click on that, you have a couple of options. You have the 3D displacement map and a height map displacement option. So what you can do is add a 3D displacement here. And again, I want to go back up a level here and grab this same map. I'm just going to throw it over in another material swatch here so I can grab it easily. Go back into my displacement. And here I have a couple of options for extrusion map and direction map. The extrusion map is where you're going to apply this black and white image. I'm just going to put that as an instance. And now I have an extrusion strength and displacement length and a couple of things to look at here. But what I want to do is increase this extrusion strength, so a vertex. So if I want this to eliminate those flat spots, I'll need to increase this. You don't want to increase it a lot, because it can add to your render times, the calculation times. So you just want to increase this just to where it stops, to the point to where it prevents this bounding box or this flattening from occurring. So what I need to do is maybe 2.5. Give that a try. And now you can see, now we have those points, and if I lower this back down to 1, it will limit that displacement a fair amount here. So you could create, I suppose, some plateaus with this if you wanted a nice flat terrain on top of a canyon. But if you want the actual terrain, you need to set this for just slightly larger than your displacement. And again, this is in world space units, so you could measure, you could put a tape down there and measure up whatever your displacement was if you wanted to do that, a measuring tape, like so. But you know, I don't know, it's kind of hard to tell because in the displacement values here, you're not using we're just using a value of 30 units. We don't know exactly what that is. Maybe 3 foot, something like that. That looks about right. But just keep in mind that if you get some flat spots on your displacement, that you can come in and increase this, and you only want to increase it the minimum amount possible. Don't just go in and put something like 50 if you don't need it. So one neat feature about this particular displacement, this 3D displacement map that you have, is that there's a direction strength and direction map that you can apply. What happens here is that this will control the direction of the displacement via a color map that you apply here, and it uses RGB for the color map. So what I'll do to show this is just let's just put a checker map in here. And what I'm going to do is assign 255 just solid red for this. Copy that down so that both color swatches are the same. And if I give this a render, you'll see that basically nothing's happened now. It looks identical to the previous render. So let me just make a copy of this. And now that I have that red color assigned in here, what I want to do is increase the strength of the direction map. Nothing happened here because the direction map strength is set to 0. Let me just increase that to 1 and render again. And now you can see that it's starting to turn or angle this displacement from our previous example. Increase this value again. And it just makes that effect even stronger. If I wanted it to go in a different direction, I could just change this. Let's try green this time. And you can see it's changing in another direction here. So what you could do is create an RGB map if you wanted to control the direction of the displacement happening. If you need to control that direction, you could do so with the colors. Obviously the blue looks like the Z axis here. So you have X, Y, and Z. So probably X would be red. So keep that in mind, that if you wanted to control the particular direction of the displacement, that you could do so with an RGB color map. And that's only when you're using this particular 3D displacement. Now there is another displacement map that we can use. And if I go back in here, you can see that we have 3D displacement. We also have the height map displacement. So let me just bring that in. And what this does is, instead of 3D, it's basically a 2D map. It's either up or down. And you can see you can adjust the height here. So like I had mentioned before, I need to go in when I'm using this particular displacement map and turn off the smoothing option. And what I'll do, I'll just drag our map over as an instance copy to this and give that a render. And it looks practically identical to the 3D map because in this case we're just a height map for a terrain. Works very well. If I wanted to decrease maybe -2 and +2, that'll increase that negative value and positive value and give you more height difference between the two here. So that's the two main displacement options that you have when working with materials here. There is another couple of options inside here. You have the 3D displacement, the height map displacement, a material to shader, which you won't use for this, and an ocean loom shader. So you could select that and use that if you wanted to actually displace the ocean waves using this ocean loom shader. I'll just leave those default values, and it's probably going to be a little bit large, but we'll see what it looks like. Now if you notice, it actually didn't do anything, and the reason for that is that when you first apply this ocean loom shader, it comes in with this bump option enabled, and that's basically telling it that it should only be used as a bump map, and it will prohibit it from this particular shader from actually creating anything other than a bump map, which we're trying to use it as displacement, so it's not going to do anything. So what I can do is just disable that and give this another render. And what it'll do this time, it'll actually displace the mesh. It's probably going to not be very pretty because of the values that it defaults to here. And as you can see, it doesn't really look much like waves in this particular case. What you could do, it's fairly strong right now, so I'll decrease the steepness, which is the height of the waves, maybe something like 0.5, and decrease the smallest wave, let's say 0.05, and the largest wave, make that smaller, maybe 2.5. Actually make that 1, and let's try that. Now things are a lot smaller. You could fine-tune this obviously I may have more information on this in a separate video once I start talking about the materials. But there are options like you can see you could turn off the flats option here to make more waves. Maybe bump that back up to 3 and let's say 0.1. If I wanted that a little bit stronger, I could increase the steepness a little bit more. If I wanted the waves to be directed, I could maybe come in and say 45 degrees. If you want them looped, you could tell it the number of frames and it'll create a seamless loop for the animation. Let me just turn that off, and let me bump that back down to 2. The quantity of waves will be the actual number of waves, and here the higher value that you put in, the more time it takes to calculate and displace, but the more detail that you get. So I'm just going to decrease that to, let's say, 6. And you can see it renders a lot quicker than when having to calculate something like, let's say, 16. It's a little bit slower when it has to do that, but you get a little more detail. And you just basically have to play with these values to find the right look for the size waves that you're going for. But I won't get too far into that. That's basically the 3 options that you have for displacement here. You have the ocean loom shader, and the 3D displacement, and the height map displacement. Now, there's one other option that I want to look at here for displacement when using mental ray, and if you come down to your materials here, you can see that we have some utility displacement combiner material here. If I click on this, and I'm just going to tell it to discard the old material, you can add whatever shader object that you want. If you wanted like the Arc and Design, you could do that. Plug that in there. Let me just change this color to something like so. And now what I have are multiple displacement maps that I can use here, and weights between them. So if I wanted, let's say, a checker map here, and let me apply this material to our object. Let's just set that to something like so. And then I wanted another material displacement map, something like a noise map. Maybe set that to fractal. And what I'll do is, let's just turn the weights down on these. I'll leave this one map weighted so that we'll see the checker pattern, and let this render. So as you can see, we have this checker pattern here. I can decrease the strength of this by this global multiplier, or the multiplier for that particular map. If I wanted to dial down any one of these individually, that's what these local multipliers are for, but the global handles all 3. So now I'll have less of a displacement effect here. And then let's bump this up to 1 for the noise map. And so now, as you can see, I'm combining displacement maps here. I can have up to 3. And so I'm getting the displacement on top of the checker map here. And so I wanted to point that out because it's a very useful map for combining multiple displacement maps. You could create some very interesting terrains using that, or whatever that you wanted to create. Be sure and give that material combiner option a try. And again, it's in the you click the material button here and scroll down to the bottom, and it's a utility displace combiner. And that, I believe, is in Max 2009 and 2010. I'm not sure if it was in Max 9 or 2008. It may have been in 2008, but I can't remember off the top of my head. So if you don't see it, it's probably not there, and but just wanted to point that out. So with all of that out of the way, I believe that will wrap up the video here on using displacement in 3ds Max and Mental Ray.